I'm calling security. We don't allow people like you to loiter here. The marble lobby of the Imperial Grand Hotel fell into an eerie silence as those words echoed off the crystal chandeliers. 3 security guards moved with practiced precision, surrounding the black man, in the $4,500 Tom Ford suit. Their handcuffs caught the light from the opulent fixtures above, creating an almost surreal contrast between luxury and humiliation. Daniel Washington adjusted his platinum cufflinks and glanced at his Audemars Piguet watch. 4:12 p.m., 18 minutes until the most important meeting of his life. A $1.2 billion merger with Samsung Electronics that had taken 3 years to negotiate. 18 minutes until everything he'd worked for would either succeed or crumble into dust. The blonde receptionist, Rebecca Martinez, stood behind the marble counter with theatrical authority. Her voice carried across the grand lobby like a prosecutor delivering a verdict. We maintain certain standards here at the Imperial Grand. We've had issues with individuals trying to use facilities they haven't paid for. Business travelers pulled out their phones instinctively. A young Asian woman at the lobby cafe, Jessica Kim, discreetly started her TikTok live stream. Her 89,000 followers were always hungry for content, and this looked like it was about to become something explosive. The security guards approached with the kind of measured authority that suggested they'd done this before. Daniel remained perfectly still, his Italian leather briefcase at his side, his expression calm despite the chaos erupting around him. He'd chosen this hotel specifically for this moment. He'd arrived at this exact time for a reason. None of this was an accident. But what Daniel Washington did next didn't just change his life. It changed an entire industry forever. To understand the magnitude of what happened that day, you need to understand the man at the center of it all. Daniel Washington wasn't born into wealth. His story began in the struggling neighborhoods of Detroit, where his mother Sandra Washington worked 3 jobs just to keep their small apartment. Sandra cleaned office buildings at night, stocked shelves at a grocery store during the day, and took in sewing on weekends. Daniel would often wake up at 3 a.m. to find his mother hunched over her old Singer sewing machine, mending clothes for neighbors to earn an extra $20 here and there. The soft whirring of that machine became the soundtrack of his childhood. Son Sandra would tell him during those early morning hours when she thought he was asleep, "The world's going to try to tell you what you can't do because of how you look. But I'm telling you what you can do because of who you are inside." Those words would echo in Daniel's mind years later, as he stood in that hotel lobby facing discrimination in a $4,000 suit. Daniel's academic brilliance became apparent early. While other kids his age were playing video games, he was devouring books on business economics and technology. The full scholarship to Harvard Business School was a dream come true, but it came with challenges Daniel hadn't anticipated. He was one of only 12 black students in his incoming class of 200. The culture shock was immediate and jarring. Cultural fit became a phrase he'd hear repeatedly during his first year. Not in his grades, he consistently ranked in the top 10% of his class. But in study groups, networking events, and social gatherings, Daniel often felt like he was performing a character rather than being himself. The breaking point came during his sophomore year. Daniel had applied for a prestigious internship at Goldman Sachs. His academic credentials were impeccable. His interview had gone exceptionally well. He'd connected with the managing director over their shared love of jazz music and had been told he was exactly the kind of fresh thinking the firm needed. 2 weeks later, he received the rejection letter. The reason given was cultural fit concerns. When he inquired further, he was told his communication style and approach to team dynamics weren't aligned with the firm's values. That night, Daniel called his mother. Through tears of frustration and disappointment, he told her he was considering dropping out. "Maybe they're right, Mom. Maybe I don't fit in this world." Sandra Washington was silent for a long moment before speaking. Baby, let me tell you something. Your great-grandfather was told he couldn't read because black folks didn't have the brains for it. He learned anyway and became a teacher. Your grandfather was told he couldn't own property because banks didn't trust his kind. He saved every penny and bought 3 buildings. I was told I couldn't provide for you because single mothers don't raise successful children. Look where you are right now. She paused, and Daniel could hear the emotion in her voice. Don't you dare let them convince you that their comfort is more important than your dreams. You earn your place at that table, and then you make sure there's room for others who look like you. That conversation changed everything. Instead of dropping out, Daniel doubled down. He graduated summa cum laude and delivered the commencement address to his class. But even with his Harvard MBA and outstanding academic record, Daniel faced rejection after rejection in the job market. 27 interviews, 19 final rounds, and 17 cultural fit rejections. It was Professor James Chen, his favorite Harvard professor and eventual mentor, who gave Daniel the advice that would shape his entire career approach. Success is the best revenge, Daniel Professor Chen said during their final meeting before graduation. But dignity is non-negotiable. Whatever you build, make sure it's built on a foundation of respect for every human being who walks through your doors. Those words would prove prophetic 20 years later. With $5,000 in savings and an unshakable belief in his vision, Daniel started Washington Ventures from a cramped studio apartment in Boston. His first office was a corner desk next to his kitchen table where he'd spend 18-hour days researching market opportunities and cold calling potential clients. The early years were brutal. Daniel survived on ramen noodles and determination, often choosing between paying for internet service or buying groceries. His first major success came with a struggling software company called TechFlow. He negotiated to buy TechFlow for $50,000, every cent he could borrow or scrape together. Within 2 years, he sold TechFlow to a larger corporation for $2.8 million. But Daniel's success wasn't just about making money. From the very beginning, he was intentional about creating opportunities for others who looked like him. Every company he acquired had to meet what he called the inclusion standard: diverse hiring practices, equitable promotion opportunities, and mentorship programs for underrepresented groups. By his 5th year in business, Washington Ventures had acquired and successfully turned around 8 companies. It was during this period that Daniel met Maria Gonzalez, a brilliant marketing executive who was consulting for one of his portfolio companies. Maria had immigrated from Mexico with her family when she was 12, speaking no English, but carrying big dreams. Their first meeting was supposed to be a standard business consultation. It ended up being a 4-hour conversation about everything from business strategy to social justice to their shared love of jazz music. Daniel knew within that first conversation that Maria was someone special. They married 2 years later in a small ceremony in Detroit, with Sandra Washington beaming as she watched her son marry the woman who had become like a daughter to her. When their daughter Sophia was born, Daniel's motivation shifted into an entirely new gear. Holding his newborn daughter in his arms, he made a promise that would drive every decision he made for the next 16 years. Baby girl, I'm going to make sure the world you grow up in is better than the one I did. By Sophia's 5th birthday, Washington Ventures had grown into a $200 million company. Daniel had been featured on the cover of Forbes magazine twice and was regularly invited to speak at conferences about inclusive business practices. But success brought new challenges and unwanted attention. As Sophia grew older, Daniel became increasingly aware of the world she would inherit. Despite his success and wealth, he couldn't shield her from every instance of prejudice or discrimination. The painful realization that money and status weren't enough to protect his daughter from racism became a driving force in his decision to expand into the hospitality industry. I can't control every interaction she'll have, Daniel explained to Maria, but I can control some of them. If I own the hotels, the restaurants, the places where memories are made, I can make sure they're places where everyone feels welcome. The incident that would ultimately lead to Daniel's test at the Imperial Grand happened on a Tuesday evening in October. Sophia, now 16, and everything Daniel and Maria had hoped she would become: intelligent, confident, compassionate, had been invited to a sweet 16 party at Le Bernardin, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. Sophia had been excited about the party for weeks. She looked stunning as she left the house that evening, poised, elegant, and radiating the kind of confidence that comes from being raised in a loving, supportive home. She insisted on taking the subway. "Dad, I'm 16. I can handle getting to a restaurant by myself," she'd laughed, kissing his cheek as she headed out the door. The call came 2 hours later. Sophia's voice was shaking as she spoke through tears. "Daddy, can you come get me? Something happened." Daniel found his daughter sitting on a bench outside the restaurant. Her new dress wrinkled, her makeup smeared from crying. The story she told him would haunt him for months. Sophia had arrived at the restaurant and approached the hostess stand to let them know she was there for the private party. The hostess, a woman in her 30s with blonde hair and a condescending smile, looked Sophia up and down before speaking. "I'm sorry, but I don't think you're in the right place. The service entrance is around back." Confused, Sophia explained that she was a guest at the party in the private dining room. The hostess's expression didn't change. "Miss, I'm going to need to see some identification and proof that you're actually invited to this event. We've had issues with people trying to sneak into private parties." Other diners had started to stare as the hostess made a show of examining Sophia's driver's license and calling the private dining room to verify her invitation. The humiliation was complete when the hostess finally reluctantly allowed Sophia to proceed to the party, but not before loudly instructing her to please respect our dress code and conduct standards. Sophia had stayed at the party for 20 minutes before excusing herself and leaving. She couldn't enjoy herself knowing that the staff saw her as a threat rather than a guest. "Daddy," Sophia said through tears, as Daniel held her that night, "why did they treat me like I was going to steal something? I was dressed nicer than half the people in there. I had an invitation. I did everything right." Daniel felt a rage he hadn't experienced since his own college days, but he controlled it. This wasn't about his anger. This was about his daughter's pain and dignity. "Baby girl," he said carefully, "some people make assumptions based on how someone looks, rather than who they are. It's not right, it's not fair, and it's not your fault." "But why does it still happen?" Sophia asked. "I thought things were supposed to be different now. You've been so successful. Mom's business is thriving. We live in a nice house. I go to a good school. Why doesn't any of that matter?" That question kept Daniel awake for weeks. Why didn't it matter? He had built an $800 million company. He employed over 3,000 people. He had been featured on magazine covers and invited to speak at prestigious conferences. But none of that protected his daughter from being humiliated by a restaurant hostess who saw her skin color before seeing anything else. The next morning, Daniel made a decision that would change everything. If he couldn't protect Sophia from every instance of discrimination, he could at least control some of the spaces where those interactions happened. It was time to expand Washington Ventures into hospitality. Within 6 months, Daniel had quietly acquired controlling stakes in 52 luxury hotels across the United States, including the Imperial Grand. But ownership wasn't enough. He needed to know what was really happening in these properties when he wasn't around. That's when he conceived Operation Mirror, a comprehensive bias audit of his own properties, conducted without the knowledge of local management. The goal was simple: identify which properties had problems, document the scope of discriminatory behavior, and implement systematic solutions. The testing protocol was sophisticated. Daniel worked with a team of diversity consultants to develop scenarios that would reveal unconscious bias without putting anyone in danger. Professional actors were hired to pose as guests in various situations. Hidden cameras documented interactions. Control groups ensured that any differences in treatment could be attributed to race, gender, or perceived socioeconomic status, rather than other factors. The results were devastating. Of the first 46 properties tested, 41 showed clear evidence of discriminatory treatment toward minority guests. Black guests were questioned about payment methods 340% more often than white guests with identical reservations. They received room upgrades 73% less frequently. They were approached by security 1,200% more often for suspicious behavior that went unnoticed when exhibited by white guests. The data was undeniable, Maria said later. Daniel came home after reviewing the first round of results and just sat at the kitchen table for hours. I'd never seen him so quietly furious. But data wasn't enough. Daniel needed concrete examples that would force people to confront the reality of what was happening. He needed to document discrimination so clearly and publicly that denial would be impossible. That's when he decided to conduct the 47th test personally at the Imperial Grand Hotel on the day of his most important business meeting. The stakes couldn't be higher. A $1.2 billion merger with Samsung Electronics that represented the culmination of 3 years of negotiations. Because my daughter's dignity is worth more than any business deal, Daniel would later explain. And if I'm not willing to risk my own comfort to change these systems, how can I ask anyone else to do the same? The Imperial Grand Hotel stood like a monument to American luxury on Manhattan's Upper East Side. Built in 1823, it had hosted presidents, celebrities, and titans of industry for over 2 centuries. The building itself was a masterpiece of neoclassical architecture, with soaring marble columns, hand-painted frescoes, and crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's houses. But beneath the opulent surface, the Imperial Grand had a problem that management preferred not to acknowledge. In the past 18 months, complaints about discriminatory treatment had increased by 34%. Guest reviews increasingly mentioned staff members who seemed to treat visitors differently based on race or perceived social status. The morning of the test, Daniel arrived at his office at 6 a.m. to make final preparations. The Samsung Electronics team, led by Vice President Park Min-joon, was flying in from Seoul specifically for this meeting. The merger between Washington Ventures and Samsung Electronics would create the largest technology-focused hospitality company in the world. Park Min-joon was known in business circles as a traditionalist who valued respect, hierarchy, and proper protocol above all else. The success of the merger depended not just on the financial terms, but on Park's assessment of Daniel's character and leadership style. In Korean business culture, personal integrity was often more important than profit margins. This isn't just a business deal, Daniel's lead attorney had warned him during preparation meetings. Park is evaluating whether you're someone Samsung can trust as a long-term partner. Any hint of instability or controversy could derail the entire negotiation. The irony wasn't lost on Daniel. Here he was preparing to potentially sabotage the biggest deal of his career in order to test whether his own employees would treat him with basic human dignity. At the Imperial Grand, Rebecca Martinez, the 24-year-old front desk clerk, was reviewing her guest list for the day. Rebecca had been working at the hotel for 10 months and prided herself on being able to read guests quickly. "It's all about pattern recognition," Rebecca would tell her friends. "You learn to spot the troublemakers before they cause problems." Rebecca had a psychology degree from a decent state university and plans to eventually move into hotel management. She saw her current position as a stepping stone to bigger opportunities, and she was determined to impress her supervisors with her attention to detail and proactive problem solving. What Rebecca didn't realize was that her pattern recognition was heavily influenced by unconscious bias. Her definition of troublemaker skewed heavily toward young men of color, even when their behavior was identical to white guests who received warm, welcoming service. Linda Thompson, the assistant manager who supervised the front desk, had 15 years of experience in luxury hospitality. She had worked her way up from housekeeping to management through sheer determination and what she called old-school customer service. The key to luxury hospitality, Linda would tell new employees, is knowing your clientele. You have to be able to tell immediately who belongs here and who doesn't. It's not about being discriminatory. It's about maintaining standards. Linda's standards were never explicitly defined, but employees quickly learned that guests who looked wealthy, spoke with certain accents, or carried themselves with particular confidence received different treatment than those who didn't fit that profile. Security Chief Rodriguez had been hired 6 months earlier from a background in military police. He brought a law enforcement mindset to hotel security that emphasized order control and quick response to potential threats. "My job is to protect the guests and the property," Rodriguez would say. Sometimes that means making difficult decisions quickly based on incomplete information. "I'd rather be overly cautious than sorry." None of these employees considered themselves racist. They would have been genuinely offended at the suggestion. They saw themselves as professional, dedicated, and committed to providing excellent service. But their unconscious biases, reinforced by institutional practices and cultural assumptions, created an environment where discrimination flourished under the guise of maintaining standards. As Daniel prepared to enter the Imperial Grand that afternoon, he knew exactly what he was walking into. He had studied the personnel files, reviewed the complaint patterns, and analyzed the incident reports. He knew which employees were most likely to exhibit biased behavior and which situations were most likely to trigger discriminatory responses. At 3:45 p.m., Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from Park Min-jun. "Landing now. Looking forward to our meeting. This partnership will benefit both our companies greatly." Daniel smiled as he read the message. In 30 minutes, he would either be celebrating the successful completion of a historic business deal or dealing with the fallout from a very public confrontation about racial bias in his own hotel. He straightened his tie, picked up his briefcase, and walked toward the Imperial Grand's imposing front entrance. The doorman, recognizing expensive clothing and confident bearing, opened the door with a welcoming smile. "Good afternoon, sir. Welcome to the Imperial Grand." Daniel nodded politely and stepped into the marble lobby where his life and the hospitality industry were about to change forever. The Imperial Grand's lobby buzzed with the quiet activity of a luxury establishment in full swing. Well-dressed guests moved across the marble floors with purpose, their conversations mixing with the soft classical music that played from hidden speakers. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light that made everything seem to glow with prosperity and sophistication. Daniel approached the reception desk with the same calm confidence he brought to every business interaction. His Italian leather shoes clicked softly against the marble, and his Audemars Piguet watch caught the light as he adjusted his sleeve. To any objective observer, he looked exactly like what he was, a successful businessman checking into a luxury hotel. Rebecca Martinez looked up from her computer screen as Daniel approached. Later, she would claim that something about him immediately seemed off, though she would never be able to articulate exactly what that meant. In reality, her unconscious bias kicked in the moment she saw a black man approaching her desk, regardless of his appearance or demeanor. "Good afternoon," Daniel said politely, setting his briefcase down beside him. "I have a reservation under Washington." Rebecca's fingers paused above her keyboard. She had been expecting this moment, not specifically, but generally. In her 10 months at the Imperial Grand, she had developed what she thought of as a sixth sense for people who didn't belong. And despite his expensive suit and confident bearing, Something about this man triggered every alarm in her head. "Are you here for a delivery?" Rebecca asked, not bothering to check her computer. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "I'm sorry I asked if you were here for a delivery." Rebecca repeated, her voice taking on a slightly condescending tone. "We have specific procedures for vendor check-ins." "No," Daniel said calmly. "I'm a guest. I have a reservation under Washington." Rebecca made a show of typing on her keyboard, though she wasn't actually accessing the reservation system. "I'm not seeing any Washington here." "Are you sure you have the right hotel?" "At a nearby seating area?" Mark Chen, a businessman waiting for his own meeting, looked up from his phone. Something about the interaction at the front desk struck him as odd. The hotel employee seemed to be giving the well-dressed black man a harder time than necessary. "I booked the presidential suite yesterday." Daniel continued patiently. "The confirmation number is PS4471WV. Rebecca's typing became more theatrical. She wanted nearby guests to see how thoroughly she was checking how diligent she was being in her verification process. "I'm still not finding anything. What did you say the name was?" "Again, Washington. WASHINGTON. And this is for tonight?" "Yes, tonight through Thursday. 3 nights total." Jessica Kim, the TikTok influencer sitting at the lobby cafe, noticed the commotion and discreetly started recording. With 89,000 followers, she had developed an instinct for content that would resonate with her audience, and this interaction looked like it might be going somewhere interesting. Rebecca continued her performance of searching the system. "I'm going to need to see some identification," she announced loudly enough for others to hear. "And I'll need proof of employment." Daniel's expression didn't change, but internally, he noted the deviation from standard check-in procedures. "Proof of employment. It's hotel policy." Rebecca lied smoothly. "We've had issues with certain urban clientele lately. People trying to use reservations they haven't actually paid for." The phrase urban clientele hung in the air like a dog whistle. Mark Chen stood up from his chair, his business instincts telling him something was very wrong. Jessica Kim's finger hovered over the Go Live button on her phone. Daniel placed his driver's license on the marble counter. "Here's my identification. As for proof of employment, I'm not sure why that would be necessary for a confirmed reservation." Rebecca examined the license with exaggerated scrutiny, as if checking for forgeries. "This address doesn't match our records," she said, though she hadn't actually checked any records. "That's my home address," Daniel explained. "The reservation was made through my company, Washington Ventures." "What kind of company?" Daniel's phone buzzed with a text. He glanced at it. Park Min-jun, letting him know the Samsung team had landed and was heading to the hotel. 15 minutes until the meeting that would determine the future of both companies. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, "but I really need to get to my room. I have an important meeting starting soon." Rebecca sensed hesitation and pressed her advantage. "Sir, I understand you're in a hurry, but we have to follow our security protocols. I'm going to need you to provide employment verification, and I'll need to call your company to confirm your identity." "You want to call my company?" "It's standard procedure for guests like you." The phrase hit the lobby like a small explosion. Mark Chen stepped forward, his phone already recording. Jessica Kim hit the Go Live button and watched as viewers immediately started joining her stream. "Excuse me, Mark," said approaching the desk. "I couldn't help but overhear. I've stayed at dozens of luxury hotels, and I've never been asked for employment verification. Is this really standard procedure?" Rebecca turned to Mark with a completely different demeanor. Warmer, more respectful. "Sir, this doesn't concern you. We're just following standard security protocols." "Standard security protocols," Mark repeated. "I checked in an hour ago, and nobody asked me for employment verification." "Every situation is different," Rebecca said defensively. At that moment, Linda Thompson appeared beside Rebecca. The assistant manager had been watching the interaction from across the lobby and decided intervention was necessary. "Is there a problem here?" Linda asked, her tone immediately, suggesting there was. "This gentleman claims to have a reservation," Rebecca explained, "but I'm having trouble verifying his information. Something doesn't add up." Linda studied Daniel with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 15 years in luxury hospitality. His suit was expensive, yes, but anyone could rent designer clothes for a day. His watch looked real, but replicas were getting better all the time. What bothered her most was his composure. He wasn't nervous enough, wasn't sufficiently deferential to their authority. "Sir," Linda said, "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside while we verify your reservation. Sometimes there are complications with certain types of bookings." "What type of booking would that be?" Daniel asked quietly. Linda's smile was thin and cold. "Corporate accounts can be tricky. We need to make sure everything is legitimate." Mark Chen stepped closer. "I have a corporate account too. Nobody questioned my legitimacy." Sir, Linda said, turning to Mark with visible irritation. "I appreciate your concern, but this really doesn't involve you. We know how to handle these situations." "These situations," Mark repeated. "What exactly do you mean by these situations?" The lobby was filling with observers now. Other guests had noticed the commotion and were gathering to watch. Some were recording on their phones. The energy in the room was shifting from curiosity to tension. Jessica Kim's live stream had reached 3,000 viewers. The comments section was exploding with reactions ranging from outrage to disbelief to support for the hotel's position. The story was starting to write itself in real time. Daniel checked his watch again. 4:05 p.m. 10 minutes until the Samsung team arrived. 10 minutes until the most important meeting of his career. But he couldn't leave now. Not when the test was revealing exactly what he had suspected. "Ma'am," Daniel said to Linda, "I've been patient with your verification process, but I need to ask, is this how you treat all guests with corporate reservations? Or just the black ones?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Linda's face flushed red, but before she could respond, Rebecca jumped in. "Sir, this has nothing to do with race. We're just following our security protocols. Security protocols that apparently don't apply to white guests," Mark Chen interjected. "Sir, please don't make this about race," Linda said. "We treat all our guests equally." Jessica Kim adjusted her phone angle to capture the full scene. Her viewer count had jumped to 5,000, and local news outlets were starting to pick up the story from social media. Imperial Grand racism was beginning to trend. Daniel opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. Inside, Linda caught a glimpse of legal documents, what looked like contracts and boarding passes from international flights. First-class Emirates boarding pass from Dubai to JFK, yesterday's flight. "I don't need to see your travel arrangements," Linda said, quickly closing the folder. "I need to see proof that you belong here." "I belong here," Daniel said quietly. "More than you know." And with those words, he was about to make the call that would change everything. But what happened next would shock everyone in that marble lobby. "Security to the main lobby." Linda Thompson's voice crackled through the hotel's communication system. "Possible trespassing situation." The word trespassing sent ripples through the gathered crowd. Phones emerged from pockets and purses, like flowers blooming in spring. The scene was being documented from multiple angles, with Jessica Kim's TikTok live stream now serving as the primary feed for thousands of viewers around the world. Within 2 minutes, 3 security guards appeared in the lobby. Chief Security Officer Rodriguez led the way, his military bearing evident in every step. Behind him, Officers Wilson and Jackson moved with the practiced coordination of a team that had handled difficult situations before. Rodriguez had been briefed during his walk to the lobby. Disruptive individual at reception. Linda had told him over the radio. Claims to have a reservation, but documentation doesn't check out. He's becoming agitated and refusing to cooperate. As Rodriguez assessed the scene, he saw exactly what he expected: a well-dressed black man arguing with hotel staff while a crowd gathered to watch. His training kicked in immediately. De-escalate, control, remove if necessary. What's the situation? Rodriguez asked Linda, positioning himself between Daniel and the reception desk. Gentleman claims to have a reservation, Linda explained, but we can't verify his identity or payment method. He's becoming increasingly argumentative. Daniel hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't moved from his position at the counter. But Linda's framing of the situation was already shaping the narrative, and Rodriguez processed her words through the filter of his own biases. Sir, Rodriguez said, turning to Daniel, I'm going to need you to step away from the desk and come with me. Officer Daniel replied calmly, I'm a guest at this hotel. I have a confirmed reservation, payment receipts, and a corporate account. I'm not sure why that requires security intervention. Rodriguez's hand moved instinctively toward his handcuffs. In his experience, suspects who remained too calm during confrontations were often the most dangerous. They were either planning something or hiding something. Sir, please place your hands where I can see them and step away from the counter. The live stream audience had grown to 8,000 viewers. Comments flooded in faster than anyone could read them. This is insane. Call a lawyer now. Someone live stream this to the news. Post this everywhere. Document everything. Mark Chen stepped forward again, his businessman's instincts outweighing his personal caution. Officer, I've been watching this entire interaction. This gentleman has been completely cooperative. He's shown identification, provided confirmation numbers, and maintained perfect composure. I'm not sure why security is necessary. Rodriguez turned to Mark with barely concealed irritation. Sir, this doesn't concern you. Please step back. It concerns everyone, Mark replied. This is 2024. We don't profile people anymore. Rebecca Martinez felt the situation spiraling beyond her control. What had started as routine threat assessment was becoming a public spectacle. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. Look, Rebecca said to Mark, her voice dropping to what she thought was a conspiratorial whisper, but was actually loud enough for the microphones to pick up. I get it. White guilt is real, but enabling this kind of behavior doesn't help anyone. The comment hit Jessica Kim's live stream like a bomb. The viewer count spiked to 12,000. Screenshots of Rebecca's comments started spreading across Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Imperial Grand racism began trending nationally. Daniel's phone buzzed. Text message from Park Min-jun. In lobby now. Where are you? Daniel looked around the marble lobby and spotted the Samsung delegation. 3 men in dark suits, moving with the precision of people accustomed to billion-dollar negotiations. Park Min-jun himself, the 62-year-old vice president, who had flown from Seoul specifically for this meeting. The Korean executives paused at the lobby entrance, taking in the scene before them. Security guards, crowd of onlookers, phones recording from every angle, and in the center of it all, the man they had come to meet. Park Min-jun had built his career on reading situations quickly and accurately. The cultural context was immediately clear to him: a successful Asian businessman watching a black businessman being confronted by security in a luxury hotel. The optics were terrible, but more importantly, the implications were profound. In Korean business culture, how a person handled adversity revealed their true character. Park had expected to meet Daniel Washington in a conference room to discuss merger terms. Instead, he was witnessing him navigate what appeared to be racial discrimination with remarkable grace under pressure. Washington San Park said, approaching through the crowd, "Are you ready for our meeting?" The lobby fell completely silent. Even the live stream comments paused as viewers processed what they had just witnessed. The Samsung investors knew Daniel personally. They had come to this hotel specifically to meet with him. The man the hotel was treating as a potential criminal was clearly someone of significant importance. Rodriguez's radio crackled to life. Patricia Williams' voice, urgent and concerned. Rodriguez, what's your status in the lobby? Ma'am, we have a situation with a guest who... Rodriguez. Patricia interrupted. Please escort Mr. Washington to the executive conference room immediately. And Rodriguez, be very, very careful. Rodriguez looked confused. Ma'am, Mr. Washington is... He's... Just escort him upstairs. Now. But it was too late for quiet resolution. Jessica Kim's live stream had reached 15,000 viewers. The story was spreading across social media platforms faster than the hotel's crisis management team could respond. News outlets were starting to pick up the feed. Daniel looked around the lobby one final time. The marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the oil paintings worth more than most people's annual salaries. He had chosen this moment, this place, this exact scenario for a reason. Ladies and gentlemen, Daniel said, his voice carrying clearly across the lobby, I think it's time you knew exactly who I am. He pulled out his phone and showed the screen to the crowd. The display showed his contact information in the hotel's VIP system. Daniel Washington, CEO, Washington Ventures, corporate account holder, lifetime platinum status. My name is Daniel Washington, he continued. I'm the CEO of Washington Ventures, and Washington Ventures owns 73% of Imperial Grand Hotels. The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca Martinez felt the blood drain from her face. Linda Thompson gripped the reception counter to steady herself. Rodriguez's hand moved away from his handcuffs, which means Daniel continued, I own this hotel, and I've been testing whether my own employees would treat a black guest with basic human dignity. The live stream exploded. 20,000 viewers became 30,000. Comments flooded in so fast they became a blur. Screenshots and clips started spreading across every social media platform. But Daniel wasn't finished. And what you're about to learn will change everything you think you know about discrimination in America. What you've witnessed today, he said, is exactly why I decided to test my own properties. For the past 12 months, Washington Ventures has been conducting bias audits across all our hospitality holdings. We hire actors, we document interactions, we measure service quality based on race, gender, and perceived economic status. He gestured toward the security cameras positioned throughout the lobby. Today wasn't an accident. This was test number 47 of 52, and everything you've seen, every assumption, every discriminatory comment, every violation of basic human dignity has been recorded. The implications began to sink in. This wasn't just discrimination caught on camera. This was a systematic test conducted by the owner of the hotel chain, designed to expose bias in his own organization. Park Min-jun stepped forward again. Washington-san, I believe we have much to discuss. Daniel nodded. Yes, we do. But first, I think some people have some very serious explaining to do. What happened next would determine whether this story became just another viral video or the beginning of a movement that would transform an entire industry. And the answer would shock everyone watching. The executive conference room on the 15th floor of the Imperial Grand Hotel was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Manhattan, while the mahogany table could seat 20 people comfortably. Today, it would serve as both courtroom and confessional. Patricia Williams paced behind her chair at the head of the table, her 25 years of hospitality experience offering no guidance for this unprecedented situation. Her phone had been ringing non-stop for the past 10 minutes. Corporate executives, public relations specialists, legal counsel, and news outlets, all demanding answers she didn't have. Daniel Washington sat calmly at the opposite end of the table. His briefcase opened documents spread with methodical precision. The Samsung Electronics delegation occupied one side of the table, their expressions unreadable, but their attention complete. On the other side sat Rebecca Martinez and Linda Thompson, looking like defendants awaiting sentencing. Rodriguez stood near the door, uncertain whether he was security or witness to what was about to unfold. The wall-mounted screen displayed a video conference connection to Washington Ventures' Manhattan headquarters, where CEO Richard Blackstone of Imperial Grand Hotels was participating remotely. His usually confident demeanor had been replaced by visible concern. Daniel Blackstone began. "I want to apologize for what happened downstairs. This doesn't represent our values or our training standards." Richard Daniel interrupted quietly. "We'll discuss apologies later. Right now we need to address the business implications of what you all witnessed today." Daniel clicked a remote, and the conference room's secondary screen came to life with a presentation titled Operation Mirror, Systematic Bias Testing Results. The first slide showed real-time social media metrics. Imperial Grand Racism, 47,000 mentions in the past 30 minutes. TikTok video views, 280,000 and climbing. Twitter impressions, 1.2 million. Instagram posts, 3,400. Stock price movement, down 2.3% in 20 minutes. These numbers represent the immediate financial impact of what happened in your lobby. Daniel said, his voice steady and professional. But they're just the beginning. He clicked to the next slide, which showed a timeline of bias testing across Washington Ventures properties over the past 12 months. Operation Mirror was conceived after my 16-year-old daughter was humiliated at a restaurant for the crime of being black in an upscale establishment. As a father, I realized I had two choices: accept that this is simply how the world works, or use my resources to change it. The slide transitioned to show testing methodology. Professional actors of different races and backgrounds, standardized scenarios, hidden cameras, and control groups to ensure statistical validity. We hired trained actors to pose as guests across all 52 of our properties. Each actor followed identical scripts, made identical requests, and exhibited identical behavior. The only variable was their race, gender, or perceived socioeconomic status. Park Min-jun leaned forward, his businessman's instincts engaged. "What were your findings?" Daniel clicked to a slide showing statistical analysis. Black guests questioned about payment methods, 340% more often than white guests. Room upgrade rates for minority guests, 73% lower than white guests. Security calls involving guests of color, 1,200% higher than white guests. Average wait time for service, 68% longer for minority guests. The data revealed systematic discrimination across 41 of our 52 properties. Daniel continued. Not isolated incidents, not misunderstandings. Systematic measurable bias that was costing us millions in lost revenue and legal settlements. Rebecca Martinez had been crying silently since entering the conference room. She now spoke for the first time, her voice barely audible. "Mr. Washington, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know you owned the hotel." Daniel turned to look at her directly. "Rebecca, you didn't know I was wealthy. You didn't know I owned this property. But you knew I was human. You knew I had identification and confirmation numbers. You knew I was behaving politely and professionally. Why wasn't that enough?" The question hung in the air like an indictment. Rebecca had no answer, because there was no good answer. "Let me show you exactly what happened downstairs," Daniel said, clicking to video footage from the lobby's security cameras. The screens filled with multiple camera angles of the entire interaction from Daniel's approach to the reception desk through the arrival of security. The footage was damning. It showed clearly that Daniel had remained calm and cooperative throughout, while hotel staff had escalated the situation based solely on assumptions and bias. Rebecca Daniels said, pausing the video at a particular moment in this frame, "You can see me providing my driver's license and confirmation number. At this point, a simple computer search would have resolved any questions about my reservation. Instead, you chose to demand employment verification." Can you explain why Rebecca's sobbing intensified? "I thought something seemed off." What seemed off? My expensive suit, my professional demeanor, my polite tone, or the color of my skin. The questions were delivered without anger, but they cut deep. Rebecca couldn't answer, because the honest answer would damn her completely. Daniel clicked to the next slide showing Rebecca's employment file. "This isn't your first incident, Rebecca. You were written up in March for treating a Hispanic family rudely. You received additional bias training in May after inappropriate comments about Muslim guests. Today wasn't an aberration. It was a pattern." He turned to Linda Thompson. "Linda, when you arrived at the reception desk, you had multiple options. You could have checked the reservation system. You could have called the corporate office. You could have asked questions designed to resolve confusion rather than escalate confrontation. Instead, you immediately supported your subordinate's discriminatory behavior and called security. Why?" Linda's voice shook as she responded. "I was following protocol." "Whose protocol?" "Show me the written policy that requires employment verification for black guests, but not white guests. Show me the training manual that instructs staff to call security when a guest provides valid identification and confirmation numbers." Linda had no response because no such policies existed. The discrimination was based on unwritten rules, unconscious bias, and cultural assumptions that everyone understood, but no one would acknowledge. Daniel clicked to a new slide showing the broader financial impact of bias across the hotel chain. The Jackson family lawsuit against our Atlanta property cost us $2.7 million in settlement and legal fees. The viral video incident at our Chicago location reduced bookings by 31% for 8 months. Today's incident will likely cost us $15 to $20 million in lost revenue over the next 12 months. Blackstone's voice crackled through the speakers. "Daniel, what do you need from us? How do we fix this?" "Richard, this isn't about fixing a public relations problem. This is about fundamentally changing how we do business." Daniel clicked to the final section of his presentation, the path forward. "We have 2 choices. We can manage discrimination as a damage control issue, apologizing when we get caught and hoping the news cycle moves on. Or we can eliminate discrimination as a business practice through systematic, measurable, accountable change." The next slide outlined a comprehensive transformation plan. AI-powered bias detection systems in real time. Mandatory monthly bias training for all employees. Anonymous guest feedback systems with immediate response protocols. Financial penalties for discriminatory behavior, including termination without severance. Public quarterly reports on bias incidents and resolution. Community oversight boards with real authority. Partnership with technology companies to develop industry-leading anti-bias tools. The investment required is significant. Daniel continued. $15 million annually for technology implementation training programs and monitoring systems. But the cost of continuing our current practices is higher. He clicked to a slide showing projected financial impact. Companies with diverse leadership and inclusive cultures outperform homogeneous organizations by 35% on average. Our bias audit showed that properties with the most inclusive practices also had the highest guest satisfaction scores, the best online reviews, and the strongest financial performance. Park Min-jun spoke for the first time since entering the conference room. Washington Sun. This is why Samsung wants to partner with your company. You understand that technology should serve human dignity, not just profit margins. Daniel smiled for the first time during the presentation. Which brings us to our original meeting purpose. He opened a new presentation labeled Samsung Washington Strategic Partnership, AI, Powered Hospitality Excellence. The merger we came here to discuss isn't just about combining our companies. It's about using Samsung's cutting-edge artificial intelligence to eliminate bias from the hospitality industry entirely. The technology was revolutionary facial recognition software that could detect discriminatory service patterns, audio analysis that identified biased language in real time, and predictive algorithms that could prevent discriminatory incidents before they occurred. We're not just talking about monitoring bias, Daniel explained. We're talking about predicting and preventing it. Samsung's AI can analyze micro-expressions, tone of voice, body language, and service timing to identify discriminatory treatment as it happens. The business implications were staggering. Hotels using the technology would be able to guarantee equal treatment for all guests, backed by data and verified by independent monitoring. Insurance companies would offer lower rates to properties with bias prevention systems. Guests would choose hotels based on verified inclusion ratings. The market opportunity is enormous, Daniel continued. Once we perfect this technology in our own properties, we can license it to every hotel chain in the world. The total addressable market is $847 billion annually. Patricia Williams found her voice for the first time since the crisis began. Mr. Washington, what about immediate consequences? What happens to the employees involved? Daniel's expression became serious again. Patricia, that's an excellent question. Rebecca, you're terminated effective immediately. Your pattern of discriminatory behavior makes you unsuitable for hospitality work. You'll receive no severance pay and no references. Rebecca's sobbing resumed, but Daniel continued without pause. Linda, you're suspended, pending a complete investigation of your management practices. If the pattern of enabling discrimination continues in your record, your employment will be terminated within the week. He turned to Rodriguez. Chief Rodriguez, you followed the procedures as you understood them, but those procedures need to change. All security personnel will receive mandatory bias training within 15 days. We're also implementing a new policy: security cannot be called on guests unless there's evidence of actual criminal behavior, not just assumptions about who belongs where. Finally, he addressed Patricia directly. Patricia, you're being transferred to our corporate office for intensive retraining. Your replacement will implement the new policies and systems. Whether you eventually return to hotel management depends on your ability to demonstrate genuine change. The immediate consequences were swift and decisive, but Daniel wasn't finished. Ladies and gentlemen, what happened in the lobby today will be documented, analyzed, and used as a training tool for every hospitality worker in our company. The video footage, the reaction patterns, the systematic failures, all of it will become part of our bias prevention curriculum. He clicked to a final slide showing implementation timeline. Samsung Washington partnership launches in 60 days. AI bias detection systems go live in 90 days. Public quarterly bias reports begin in 4 months. Full industry rollout within 18 months. The scope of the transformation was breathtaking. Daniel wasn't just changing his own company. He was creating a new standard for an entire industry. Park Min-jun nodded slowly. This is exactly the kind of visionary leadership Samsung seeks in partners. The merger proceeds as planned, but we want to accelerate the bias prevention technology development. Daniel smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. As the meeting transitioned from crisis management to strategic planning, one thing became clear. What had started as a discrimination incident in a hotel lobby was becoming a catalyst for systematic change across an $847 billion industry. But what happened next would determine whether this transformation would succeed or fail. And the answer would surprise everyone. The Imperial Grand's marble lobby had been transformed into a media circus. News crews from CNN, ABC, NBC, and local stations crowded the entrance, their cameras and lights turning the elegant space into a television studio. Reporters pushed microphones toward anyone willing to speak, while social media influencers live-streamed their reactions to the unfolding story. Jessica Kim found herself at the center of the storm. Her TikTok livestream, which had captured the entire discrimination incident in real time, had been viewed over 500,000 times. Major news outlets were requesting permission to use her footage, and her follower count had jumped from 89,000 to 340,000 in just 2 hours. I came here for coffee and ended up documenting what might be the most important business story of the year, Jessica told a CNN reporter. This isn't just about one hotel or one incident. This is about systematic discrimination that happens every day in luxury establishments across America. The hashtag Imperial Grand Racism had exploded across social media platforms. On Twitter, it was trending nationally, alongside Bias Audit and Operation Mirror. Instagram posts showing screenshots from the live stream had accumulated millions of views. LinkedIn was flooded with business professionals sharing their own experiences with discrimination in corporate settings. The comment sections revealed a deeply divided response. Finally, a CEO who puts his money where his mouth is. This is what real leadership looks like. Every company should do bias audits like this. About time someone called out systemic racism in hospitality. But there were also critics. This feels like a publicity stunt. Why risk a billion-dollar deal for social media attention? Seems like reverse discrimination to me. What about the employees who lost their jobs? Daniel Washington stood behind the same reception desk where he had been humiliated just hours earlier. This time he wore a hotel name tag reading, D. Washington Owner. The irony wasn't lost on the hundreds of people gathered to hear his statement. Ladies and gentlemen, Daniel began, his voice carrying clearly across the crowded lobby. Thank you for your attention. What happened here today represents both a problem and an opportunity. The crowd of reporters, hotel guests, and onlookers fell silent. Camera flashes illuminated the marble columns as dozens of news organizations documented every word. At 4:12 p.m. today, I was denied service at my own hotel because of my race. By 4:20 p.m., security was called to remove me from property I own. By 4:45 p.m., we had terminated the employees responsible and begun implementing systematic changes. Daniel gestured toward the reception desk where Rebecca Martinez had worked just hours earlier. Rebecca Martinez is no longer employed by Imperial Grand Hotels. Her actions today violated company policy, federal civil rights law, and basic human decency. She will not receive severance pay or references. The reporters scribbled notes frantically as Daniel continued. Linda Thompson has been suspended pending investigation. Her pattern of enabling discriminatory behavior makes her unsuitable for hospitality management. We expect her employment to be terminated within the week. He clicked a remote, and the lobby's large screens displayed a comprehensive policy document. Effective immediately, all Imperial Grand properties will implement the following changes. The screens showed a detailed reform package. Real-time bias monitoring. AI systems will analyze guest interactions for discrimination indicators. Automatic alerts will trigger immediate management intervention. Staff displaying biased behavior will receive immediate corrective action. Guest feedback revolution. Mobile app reporting system for discriminatory treatment. Anonymous hotline with 24-hour response guarantee. Public dashboard showing bias incident resolution rates. Employee accountability. Monthly bias training mandatory for all staff. Financial penalties for discrimination, including immediate termination. Performance reviews will include inclusion metrics. Transparency initiative. Quarterly public reports on bias incidents and resolution. Guest satisfaction data, broken down by demographic groups. Independent audits by civil rights organizations. Financial consequences. Any employee found guilty of discrimination will be terminated without severance. Managers who fail to address bias will face similar consequences. Property managers will be evaluated on inclusion performance. A CNN reporter raised her hand. Mr. Washington, critics might say this is performative. How do we know these changes will actually happen and aren't just a response to bad publicity? Daniel smiled. Because we're partnering with Samsung Electronics to implement AI-powered bias detection across all our properties. The technology launches in 60 days. The data will be public. There's nowhere to hide. He clicked to the next slide, showing technical specifications and partnership details. Samsung's artificial intelligence can detect discriminatory language, measure service quality differences across demographic groups, and identify bias patterns in real time. Every guest interaction will be monitored and analyzed. Any deviation from our inclusion standards will trigger immediate intervention. The financial implications were staggering. The technology investment alone would cost $15 million annually. The training programs added another $3 million. The monitoring and reporting systems required ongoing operational changes worth millions more. Some will say this is expensive, Daniel continued. But discrimination is more expensive. Today's incident has already cost us $4.2 million in lost bookings based on our initial analysis. Our Atlanta lawsuit cost us $2.7 million. The Chicago incident reduced revenue by $12.4 million over 8 months. He looked directly at the cameras. Bias isn't just morally wrong. It's financially stupid. Mark Chen, the businessman who had defended Daniel during the original incident, stepped forward. Mr. Washington, I want to publicly apologize for not intervening more decisively earlier. I saw what was happening and didn't act quickly enough. Daniel nodded. Mark, your support today mattered more than you know. But you're right. We all have a responsibility to speak up when we see discrimination happening. The Samsung Electronics delegation appeared beside Daniel. Park Min-jun stepped to the microphone with the measured authority of someone accustomed to billion-dollar announcements. Samsung Electronics is proud to partner with Washington Ventures, Park said. Mr. Washington represents the future of American business. Leaders who understand that technology should serve human dignity, not just corporate profits. The partnership announcement made immediate business news. Stock prices for both companies jumped. The bias prevention technology became a talking point for investors and analysts. Industry publications began speculating about competitive responses. But the most important reaction came from unexpected sources. A young black woman in the crowd stepped forward, tears in her eyes. Mr. Washington, I work at a hotel in Chicago. Last month, a guest complained that I was too aggressive when I was just doing my job the same way my white coworkers do. My manager sided with the guest and wrote me up. Seeing what you did today, it gives me hope that things can actually change. An older white man raised his hand. I'm a retired hotel executive. I worked in this industry for 30 years, and I saw this kind of discrimination constantly. I'm ashamed to admit I often looked the other way because it was just business. What you're doing takes real courage. A Hispanic couple approached with their teenage daughter. Our family was treated badly at a luxury resort last year, the father said. Our daughter asked us why the staff acted like we didn't belong there. We didn't have a good answer. Now we can tell her that some people are working to change things. These personal testimonials reminded everyone that the statistics and policy changes represented real human experiences of dignity and humiliation. Jessica Kim ended her extended live stream with a message that captured the moment. I came here for coffee and witnessed history. This is what accountability looks like. This is what change looks like. This is what hope looks like. The crowd began to disperse as the evening news crews prepared their reports. The lobby returned to its normal, elegant calm, but something fundamental had shifted. The marble floors and crystal chandeliers looked the same, but the culture they represented was transforming. Daniel Washington remained at the reception desk for another hour, greeting guests personally, ensuring everyone felt welcome, making sure that what happened today would ripple outward into systematic change. The test was complete. The results were documented. The transformation had begun. But what happened next would determine whether this moment became just another viral video or the beginning of a movement that would change America forever. 6 months after the Imperial Grand incident, the transformation of Washington Ventures' hospitality empire was both visible and measurable. The marble lobby where Daniel Washington had been confronted by security now featured discreet AI monitoring stations and a diverse staff that had been recruited, trained, and evaluated using new inclusion standards. Maria Santos, the new head receptionist, greeted every guest with genuine warmth that was both personal and professional. The AI monitoring system tracked her interactions in real time, but it rarely flagged issues anymore. The cultural change had been comprehensive and authentic. "Good evening, Mr. Peterson," Maria said to a black businessman checking in for a corporate conference. "I see you're with the Microsoft delegation. We have your suite ready, and I've arranged for early check-in for your colleagues arriving tomorrow." The interaction was smooth, professional, and respectful. Exactly what it should have been all along. But 6 months ago, Mr. Peterson might have faced the same discrimination that Daniel had experienced. The transformation hadn't been easy. Of the original 52 properties in the Washington Ventures portfolio, 17 managers had been terminated for failing to implement inclusion standards. Over 200 frontline employees had been replaced. The company had invested $47 million in technology training and cultural change initiatives. But the results were undeniable. Guest satisfaction scores increased 34% across all demographics. Online reviews improved from an average of 3.4 to 4.8 stars. Revenue grew 28% year over year, despite the economic uncertainties. Employee retention improved by 41%. Legal settlements for discrimination dropped to 0. More importantly, the human impact was transformative. Daniel received thousands of messages from guests sharing their experiences. "My family stayed at your Houston property last month. For the first time in my life, I felt completely welcome at a luxury hotel. My teenage daughter said, 'Dad, this is how everywhere should feel. Thank you for making that possible. I'm a traveling nurse, and I've faced discrimination at hotels across the country. Your staff in Denver treated me with such respect and professionalism. It reminded me that change is possible when people care enough to make it happen. As a Muslim woman who wears hijab, I often feel judged in upscale establishments. Your team in Atlanta was so welcoming and accommodating. Small gestures matter more than you know." These stories represented the real victory, not the business metrics or the media coverage, but the human dignity that had been restored and protected. The Samsung partnership had exceeded all expectations. The AI bias detection technology was now being licensed to hotel chains worldwide. Marriott, Hilton, and Hyatt had all announced plans to implement similar systems. The technology that had been developed to solve Washington Ventures' internal problems was becoming an industry standard. "We've created a market for inclusion," Samsung's Park Min-jun explained during a joint presentation at the Global Hospitality Conference. "Companies that can demonstrably prove their commitment to equal treatment have a competitive advantage with both guests and investors." The financial markets had taken notice. Washington Ventures' valuation had increased by 67% since the Imperial Grand incident. Institutional investors were specifically seeking companies with strong environmental, social, and governance credentials, and Daniel's systematic approach to bias elimination had become a model for corporate responsibility. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation was happening in the Washington family itself. Sophia Washington, now a senior in high school, had become a powerful voice for youth activism. The humiliation she had experienced at Le Bernardin had been transformed into purpose and advocacy. She spoke at conferences, wrote articles for her school newspaper, and had started a non-profit organization called Dignity First that worked with businesses to eliminate discriminatory practices. "My father showed me that you don't have to accept injustice," Sophia said during a TEDx talk that had been viewed over 2 million times. "You can use your resources, your platform, and your voice to change systems that harm people. But change requires more than good intentions. It requires measurement, accountability, and sustained commitment." The 17-year-old had inherited her father's strategic mind and her mother's communication skills. College admissions officers from Harvard, Stanford, and MIT were actively recruiting her, not just for her academic achievements, but for her demonstrated leadership in social justice. Maria Washington had also found her voice in new ways. Her marketing consultancy had expanded into diversity and inclusion consulting, helping companies implement bias prevention strategies across various industries. Her immigrant experience and business expertise made her a sought-after speaker and advisor. What Daniel did at the Imperial Grand wasn't just about hotels, Maria explained during a Fortune 500 CEO summit. It was about proving that businesses can be profitable and principled simultaneously. The false choice between doing well and doing good is exactly that: false. The Washington family had become inadvertent symbols of how personal experiences of discrimination could be transformed into systematic change. But they were careful not to let symbolism replace substance. "We're not heroes," Daniel said during a Harvard Business School case study discussion. "We're business people who decided that human dignity was non-negotiable. The real heroes are the employees who embraced change, the guests who shared their stories, and the industry leaders who chose to follow rather than resist." The Harvard case study titled Operation Mirror: Using Bias Audits to Transform Corporate Culture had become required reading in business schools across the country. Students analyzed the decision-making process, the financial implications, and the change management strategies that had made the transformation successful. But the case study also raised uncomfortable questions that business students had to grapple with. How many other companies were unknowingly perpetuating discrimination? What responsibility did successful business leaders have to address systematic inequality? Could bias audits and AI monitoring become tools of surveillance rather than liberation? Was Washington's approach scalable across different industries and company sizes? These questions didn't have easy answers, which made them valuable teaching tools for the next generation of business leaders. The transformation had also attracted attention from unexpected quarters. The United Nations had invited Daniel to speak about bias prevention technology at their annual Global Compact meeting. European hotel chains were implementing Washington's Samsung technology ahead of new EU regulations, requiring bias monitoring in hospitality. The model was going global. What started as a father trying to protect his daughter's dignity has become a movement, observed Dr. Jennifer Chen, a business ethics professor at Wharton. The question now is whether other industries will learn from hospitality or wait for their own Imperial Grand moments. The answer was already becoming clear. Financial services companies were implementing bias audits in lending practices. Retail chains were analyzing customer service patterns across demographic groups. Healthcare systems were examining whether patient care varied based on race or socioeconomic status. The tools and methodologies that Daniel had developed for hotels were being adapted across industries because the underlying problem, unconscious bias affecting business decisions, was universal. But success also brought new challenges. As Washington Ventures grew larger and more influential, the scrutiny intensified. Competitors questioned whether the company's inclusion initiatives gave it unfair advantages in recruiting and customer acquisition. Shareholders occasionally wondered whether the bias prevention investments were reducing short-term profitability for long-term social goals. Daniel addressed these concerns directly during quarterly investor calls. "We believe that inclusion is a competitive advantage, not a social burden. Our metrics prove that diverse teams make better decisions. Inclusive cultures attract better talent, and respectful service creates more loyal customers. We're not sacrificing profitability for principles. We're using principles to drive profitability." The data supported his argument consistently. Properties with the strongest inclusion metrics also had the highest financial performance. The correlation was clear and consistent across market seasons and economic conditions. But what happened next would test whether this transformation could survive its first major crisis. And the challenge would come from an unexpected source. The transformation that began in the Imperial Grand's marble lobby had sent shockwaves throughout the hospitality industry and beyond. Within 12 months of Daniel Washington's test, the landscape of American business was shifting in ways that few could have predicted. The most immediate impact was felt by Washington Ventures' direct competitors. Hotel chains that had previously dismissed bias concerns as political correctness suddenly found themselves losing market share to properties that could demonstrate measurable inclusion practices. Marriott International was the first major competitor to announce a comprehensive bias audit program. CEO Anthony Capuano made the announcement during the company's quarterly earnings call. "The marketplace has evolved. Our guests increasingly choose brands based on values, not just amenities. We're implementing AI-powered bias detection across all our properties because it's both the right thing to do and the smart business decision." Hilton followed within weeks, announcing a $50 million investment in bias prevention technology and training programs. Hyatt Four Seasons and even budget chains like Hampton Inn began developing their own inclusion initiatives. The industry trade publication Hotel Management ran a cover story titled "The Washington Effect: How One Test Changed Everything." The article documented how bias audits had become standard practice across major hotel chains, with some companies hiring third-party firms to conduct regular discrimination testing. "It's like Daniel Washington threw a stone into a lake," explained Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a hospitality industry analyst. "The ripples just keep spreading outward." But the transformation extended far beyond hotels. The bias detection technology developed by Samsung and Washington Ventures was being adapted for retail banking, healthcare, and even education. Target Corporation implemented customer service monitoring after internal studies revealed that Black and Hispanic shoppers were followed by security at significantly higher rates than white customers. The retailer's CEO, Brian Cornell, cited Washington's methodology as inspiration for their approach. "We realized we had a choice," Cornell said during a retail industry conference. "We could wait for our own viral video moment, or we could proactively identify and address bias in our operations." Daniel Washington showed us that systematic testing and transparent accountability aren't just ethical imperatives. They're competitive advantages. Bank of America launched a bias audit of their lending practices after discovering disparities in loan approval rates that couldn't be explained by creditworthiness alone. The audit revealed that loan officers were unconsciously applying different standards to minority applicants, even when using supposedly objective criteria. "The bias was subtle, but systematic," explained Chief Risk Officer Alistair Borthwick. "Our officers weren't intentionally discriminating, but their unconscious biases were affecting business decisions. The Washington model gave us a framework for identifying and correcting these patterns. The healthcare industry proved to be another fertile ground for bias detection technology. Studies had long shown that pain medication was prescribed at different rates for black and white patients with identical symptoms, but hospitals had struggled to address the problem systematically. Johns Hopkins Hospital implemented real-time bias monitoring in their emergency department using AI to analyze treatment patterns and flag potential disparities. The results were sobering. Black patients waited an average of 23% longer for pain medication and were 31% less likely to receive adequate pain management. The data forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about our own practices, said Dr. Lisa Cooper, director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Equity. But confronting those truths was the first step toward changing them. The educational sector also began adopting Washington's methodology. School districts used bias audits to examine disciplinary practices, finding that Black and Hispanic students were suspended at dramatically higher rates for identical infractions. Universities implemented bias detection in admissions processes, faculty hiring, and student services. The University of California system announced a comprehensive bias audit program across all 10 campuses, examining everything from classroom interactions to research funding allocation. Higher education has a responsibility to model the inclusive practices we want to see in society, said UC President Michael Drake. The Washington approach gives us the tools to move beyond good intentions toward measurable change. The transformation wasn't limited to American institutions. European hotel chains began implementing bias detection ahead of new EU regulations requiring discrimination monitoring in hospitality. The European Union was considering legislation that would mandate bias audits across multiple industries. The United States is leading the world in bias prevention technology, observed Dr. Fatima Al-Rashid, a researcher at the European Center for Human Rights. European companies are scrambling to catch up because they recognize this as the future of business practice. The technology itself continued evolving. Samsung's AI systems became more sophisticated, able to detect increasingly subtle forms of bias. The algorithms could now identify microaggressions, analyze body language patterns, and even detect bias in written communications. But the most significant development was the emergence of bias-free certification as a standard business practice. Companies that could demonstrate systematic bias prevention through third-party audits began receiving preferential treatment from investors, customers, and partners. Goldman Sachs announced that bias-free certification would become a factor in their investment decisions. Environmental, social, and governance factors are increasingly important to our clients, explained Chief Sustainability Officer Dina Powell McCormick. Companies that can prove their commitment to inclusion represent better long-term investments. The certification process was rigorous. Companies had to undergo comprehensive bias audits, implement systematic prevention measures, and submit to ongoing monitoring. The standards were high, but the business benefits were substantial. Insurance companies began offering lower premiums to certified bias-free organizations, recognizing that inclusive companies had fewer legal liabilities and better risk profiles. Government contracts increasingly required bias-free certification as a prerequisite for bidding. We've created a market incentive for inclusion, explained Dr. James Patterson, an economist studying the phenomenon. Companies that can demonstrably prove their commitment to equal treatment have tangible competitive advantages. The transformation also created new career paths and business opportunities. Bias audit consultants became highly sought-after professionals. Universities launched degree programs in inclusion technology. Venture capital firms specializing in bias prevention startups raised billions in funding. Jessica Kim, the TikTok influencer, who had live-streamed the original Imperial Grand incident, parlayed her viral fame into a successful consulting business, helping companies navigate bias-related public relations crises. Her follower count had grown to over 2 million, and her content focused on documenting positive changes in corporate behavior. I realized I had a platform and a responsibility, Jessica explained during a social media marketing conference. Instead of just calling out bad behavior, I wanted to highlight companies doing the hard work of change. Rebecca Martinez, the former Imperial Grand Receptionist, whose discriminatory behavior had catalyzed the entire movement, had completed a remarkable transformation of her own. After losing her job, she had enrolled in bias counseling and diversity training. She now worked as a bias prevention educator, sharing her story as a cautionary tale about unconscious discrimination. I was raised to believe I wasn't racist because I didn't use slurs or join hate groups, Rebecca said during a presentation to hospitality workers. But I learned that bias doesn't require hatred. It just requires assumptions. My assumptions about who belonged in luxury spaces were wrong, and they caused real harm to real people. Rebecca's redemption story became a powerful example of how individuals could change when given the right tools and motivation. Her presentations were emotional and effective, helping employees recognize their own potential for unconscious bias. The legal landscape was also evolving. Class action lawsuits against companies for systematic discrimination became more common as bias audit data provided concrete evidence of disparate treatment. But companies with robust bias prevention programs found themselves largely protected from such litigation. The legal standard is shifting, explained civil rights attorney David Chen. Courts are beginning to expect companies to have systematic bias prevention measures in place. Organizations that can't demonstrate proactive efforts to address discrimination face significantly higher liability. Congress began considering federal legislation that would require bias audits for companies above certain size thresholds. The proposed Corporate Accountability for Bias Prevention Act would mandate regular discrimination testing and public reporting for companies with more than 1,000 employees. The private sector has shown that systematic bias prevention is both possible and profitable, said Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, one of the bill's sponsors. It's time to make these practices standard rather than exceptional. The legislation faced opposition from business groups concerned about costs and regulatory burden, but polling showed strong public support for bias prevention requirements. The debate reflected a broader cultural shift toward expecting corporations to actively promote equality rather than simply avoiding overt discrimination. But as the movement gained momentum, it also attracted resistance. And the pushback would test whether the transformation could survive its first major challenge. Not everyone embraced the bias prevention movement with enthusiasm. As systematic monitoring and accountability measures spread across industries, resistance emerged from multiple quarters, creating complex challenges for organizations trying to implement inclusive practices. The most vocal opposition came from conservative political commentators who framed bias detection technology as surveillance capitalism and political correctness run amok. Fox News host Tucker Carlson devoted multiple segments to criticizing what he called woke monitoring systems that criminalize normal human behavior. This technology isn't about preventing discrimination. It's about controlling thoughts and enforcing ideological conformity, Carlson argued during a particularly heated segment. Soon, artificial intelligence will be monitoring every interaction between Americans to make sure they conform to progressive orthodoxy. The criticism gained traction among viewers who were already skeptical of corporate diversity initiatives. Social media groups formed to organize boycotts of companies implementing bias monitoring, though their effectiveness was limited by the widespread adoption of the technology. More substantive challenges came from legal scholars and civil liberties advocates who raised legitimate concerns about privacy and due process. The American Civil Liberties Union published a detailed analysis questioning whether bias monitoring systems violated employee privacy rights and customer expectations. While we support efforts to combat discrimination, we're concerned about the expansion of workplace surveillance and algorithmic decision-making without adequate safeguards, said ACLU attorney David Cole. These systems collect massive amounts of data about human behavior and make judgments that can affect people's livelihoods. The ACLU's concerns weren't entirely theoretical. Several high-profile cases emerged where bias detection algorithms had flagged employees for discriminatory behavior based on false positives or misinterpreted data. At a Marriott hotel in Denver, front desk clerk Jennifer Walsh was suspended after the AI system flagged her interactions with minority guests as potentially biased. The algorithm had detected that Walsh spoke more quietly and made less eye contact with black guests than with white guests. The investigation revealed that Walsh suffered from social anxiety that made her uncomfortable with direct eye contact, and she unconsciously spoke more quietly when nervous. Her behavior with minority guests reflected her personal anxiety about saying something inappropriate, not racial bias. I was trying so hard not to seem racist that I ended up seeming racist to the computer, Walsh explained during her appeal hearing. The technology couldn't distinguish between bias and anxiety. Walsh was eventually reinstated after human review revealed the misinterpretation, but her case became a rallying point for critics who argued that algorithmic bias detection was unreliable and potentially harmful to innocent employees. The technology companies developing bias detection systems acknowledged these challenges and worked to improve their algorithms. Samsung invested heavily in reducing false positives and incorporating human judgment into automated flagging systems. No AI system is perfect, and human behavior is complex, admitted Dr. James Park, Samsung's lead researcher on bias detection technology. We're constantly improving our algorithms to better distinguish between genuine bias and other factors that might affect behavior. The improvements helped reduce false positives by 78%, but concerns remained about the fundamental premise of algorithmic behavior monitoring. Privacy advocates argued that comprehensive surveillance of human interactions was incompatible with democratic values regardless of the stated purpose. Employee unions also pushed back against bias monitoring, arguing that the technology created hostile work environments where employees felt constantly watched and judged. The Service Employees International Union filed grievances at several hotels, claiming that bias detection systems violated collective bargaining agreements. Workers are already under enormous pressure to provide excellent customer service, said SEIU Representative Maria Gonzalez. Adding algorithmic monitoring that could get them fired for unconscious behaviors creates an atmosphere of fear and paranoia. The union concerns led to negotiated agreements that included employee protections and appeal processes for bias-related disciplinary actions. Workers gained the right to human review of algorithmic decisions and additional training opportunities before termination. Some of the most sophisticated resistance came from business leaders who questioned the cost-effectiveness of comprehensive bias prevention programs. A study by the American Enterprise Institute argued that the technology created more problems than it solved. Companies are spending billions of dollars to address bias that may not significantly impact business outcomes, argued AEI researcher Dr. Christina Hoff Summers. The opportunity cost of these investments could be enormous, and the benefits remain largely theoretical. The AEI study claimed that bias prevention programs reduced productivity and employee satisfaction while providing minimal, measurable improvements in customer service or financial performance. However, the methodology was heavily criticized by other researchers who noted that the study failed to account for long-term benefits and indirect effects. Independent analysis by McKinsey & Company reached opposite conclusions, finding that companies with comprehensive bias prevention programs outperformed their peers across multiple metrics, including revenue growth, employee retention, and customer satisfaction. The business case for bias prevention is overwhelming when you look at comprehensive data over meaningful time periods, explained McKinsey partner, Dr. Lorena Yee. Companies that invest in inclusion see measurable returns on investment within 18 months. The conflicting studies reflected deeper ideological divisions about the role of business in addressing social problems. Conservative think tanks generally opposed bias prevention mandates, while progressive organizations strongly supported them. Legal challenges also emerged from multiple directions. Several companies sued to block state-level bias monitoring requirements, arguing that the mandates violated interstate commerce clauses and imposed unreasonable regulatory burdens. The most significant case, TechCorp versus California, challenged that state's requirement that companies with more than 1,000 employees implement bias detection systems. TechCorp argued that the mandate violated federal commerce authority and exceeded state regulatory power. The case wound its way through federal courts while attracting attention from business groups and civil rights organizations. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled 7-2 that states had legitimate authority to require bias prevention measures as part of their civil rights enforcement responsibilities. States have long regulated employment practices to prevent discrimination, wrote Justice Elena Kagan in the majority opinion. Requiring systematic bias monitoring is a reasonable extension of existing civil rights law, not an unprecedented expansion of state authority. The Supreme Court decision largely settled the legal questions around bias monitoring mandates, but political resistance continued. Several states passed laws restricting how bias detection data could be used, limiting penalties for algorithmic violations, and requiring extensive due process protections for employees. Religious organizations raised their own set of concerns about bias prevention requirements. Several faith-based institutions argued that bias monitoring conflicted with their religious freedom to make employment and service decisions based on religious beliefs. The Catholic Church, Orthodox Jewish organizations, and evangelical Protestant groups formed a coalition to oppose bias monitoring requirements for religious institutions. They argued that algorithmic systems couldn't distinguish between legitimate religious considerations and unlawful discrimination. Our hiring and service decisions are based on religious doctrine, not racial bias, explained Cardinal Timothy Dolan of New York. But artificial intelligence can't understand the difference between faith-based choices and discriminatory behavior. The religious freedom challenges led to negotiated exemptions for faith-based organizations in many jurisdictions, though civil rights groups argued that the exemptions created loopholes that could be exploited to avoid accountability. International resistance also emerged as American companies tried to implement bias prevention programs in overseas operations. Several countries, including China and Russia, banned bias detection technology as foreign surveillance tools. These systems are designed to monitor and control human behavior in ways that violate our sovereignty, argued Chinese Trade Representative Liu Xiaoming. We will not allow American technology companies to impose their ideological frameworks on Chinese workers and consumers. The international resistance limited the global expansion of bias prevention programs and created competitive disadvantages for American companies in some markets. However, European and democratic Asian countries generally embrace the technology as evidence of corporate responsibility. Despite the various forms of resistance, the bias prevention movement continued expanding. Public opinion polls consistently showed strong support for systematic efforts to address discrimination, even when people had concerns about specific implementation methods. A Pew Research study found that 73% of Americans supported requiring large companies to monitor for bias, even though 41% had concerns about privacy implications. The polling suggested that most people viewed bias prevention as a necessary response to persistent discrimination. Americans want companies to address discrimination, but they also want protections against misuse of monitoring technology, explained Pew researcher Dr. Monica Anderson. The challenge is implementing systems that achieve both goals simultaneously. The resistance and pushback ultimately strengthened the bias prevention movement by forcing advocates to address legitimate concerns and improve their approaches. Technology companies developed better algorithms. Companies implemented stronger employee protections, and policymakers created more nuanced regulations. Opposition made us better reflected. Daniel Washington, during a conference on bias prevention best practices, we had to prove that our systems were fair, effective, and respectful of individual rights. That made the technology more robust and the policies more balanced. The movement also benefited from generational change. Younger Americans who had grown up with comprehensive digital monitoring in schools and social media were less concerned about privacy implications of bias detection technology. My generation is used to algorithmic systems monitoring our behavior, explained Sophia Washington during her senior year at Harvard. We see bias detection as a positive use of technology that we're already subject to anyway. As the movement matured, it became clear that resistance was slowing implementation rather than preventing it. The business case for bias prevention was too strong, and the cultural momentum too powerful for opposition to permanently derail systematic efforts to address discrimination. But the resistance served an important function by ensuring that bias prevention programs included appropriate safeguards and protections. The movement became more sustainable because it had to address legitimate concerns rather than simply imposing change through corporate or government authority. And now, 5 years later, the world would see just how profound this transformation had become. 5 years after Daniel Washington's test at the Imperial Grand Hotel, bias prevention had become so integrated into American business practices that it was difficult to remember how organizations had operated without systematic monitoring and accountability measures. The transformation was perhaps most visible in the hospitality industry, where the movement had begun. A family checking into any major hotel chain could expect consistent, respectful service regardless of their race, ethnicity, or perceived socioeconomic status. The variations in treatment that had once been routine were now rare exceptions that triggered immediate investigation and correction. The Marriott hotel chain, which had been among the first to adopt comprehensive bias prevention after Washington's example, reported that guest satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs across all demographic groups. More importantly, the variation in satisfaction between different groups had virtually disappeared. "We've achieved something that seemed impossible 5 years ago," explained Marriott CEO Anthony Capuano during the company's annual investor meeting. "We provide genuinely equal service to all guests, and we can prove it with data. Our monitoring systems have processed over 50 million guest interactions, and bias incidents have decreased by 94%. The business results were equally impressive. Hotels with comprehensive bias prevention programs consistently outperformed their competitors in revenue per available room, customer loyalty, and online review scores. The correlation between inclusion and profitability had become so clear that bias prevention was now considered essential for competitive success. For the Washington family, the transformation had brought both vindication and new challenges. Daniel's company, Washington Ventures, had grown into a $4.2 billion enterprise with properties and investments across multiple industries. The Samsung partnership had expanded beyond bias detection into comprehensive AI-powered inclusion technology. But success also brought scrutiny and responsibility. Daniel found himself frequently called upon to testify before Congress, speak at international conferences, and advise other CEOs on inclusion strategies. The role of accidental civil rights leader sometimes conflicted with his primary identity as a businessman and father. "I never set out to become a spokesperson for corporate responsibility," Daniel reflected during an interview with Harvard Business Review. "I just wanted to protect my daughter and build a successful company. But sometimes individual actions create movements that take on lives of their own. Sophia Washington, now a senior at Harvard, majoring in social psychology and business ethics, had inherited her father's strategic mind and her mother's communication skills. Her thesis research on algorithmic bias detection was being funded by the National Science Foundation and had attracted attention from technology companies seeking to improve their systems. My generation doesn't see bias prevention as revolutionary. We see it as basic competence, Sophia explained during a campus speaking event. Companies that can't treat people fairly are like companies that can't manage their finances or maintain quality control. They're just poorly run organizations. Sophia's perspective reflected a broader generational shift. Young professionals refused job offers from companies without comprehensive inclusion programs. Young consumers actively sought out businesses with verified bias-free certification. The market pressure for systematic equality had become overwhelming. The technology itself had evolved dramatically since the original Samsung-Washington partnership. Third-generation bias detection systems could analyze not just obvious discriminatory behavior, but subtle patterns of microaggressions, unconscious favoritism, and institutional barriers that previous generations of technology had missed. The systems had also become more sophisticated about distinguishing between genuine bias and other factors that might affect behavior. False positive rates had dropped to less than 2%, and employee satisfaction with bias monitoring had actually increased as workers came to trust the fairness and accuracy of the systems. The technology has reached a level of sophistication where it feels less like surveillance and more like coaching, explained Dr. Jennifer Park, who had taken over Samsung's bias detection research program. The systems provide real-time feedback that helps employees improve their interactions rather than just catching them when they make mistakes. The coaching approach had proven more effective than punitive measures. Instead of simply flagging bias incidents, the systems now provided immediate suggestions for better approaches and tracked improvement over time. Employees who struggled with unconscious bias received additional training and support rather than automatic termination. The results were remarkable. Customer service quality had improved dramatically across all industries implementing bias prevention technology. Employee satisfaction had increased as workers felt more confident in their ability to provide excellent service to diverse customers. Legal liabilities for discrimination had virtually disappeared for companies with comprehensive programs. The education sector had perhaps seen the most dramatic transformation. School districts using bias detection technology reported that achievement gaps between racial and ethnic groups had narrowed significantly. Disciplinary disparities had largely disappeared. Teacher satisfaction had increased as educators felt better equipped to serve all students effectively. We've moved from hoping that teachers would treat all students fairly to ensuring that they do, explained Dr. Michelle Washington, who had become the superintendent of Chicago Public Schools. The technology doesn't replace good teaching. It helps good teachers be more effective with all their students. Healthcare had also been revolutionized by systematic bias prevention. Hospitals using AI monitoring reported that treatment disparities had decreased by 89%, while patient satisfaction had reached unprecedented levels across all demographic groups. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, who led bias prevention efforts at Johns Hopkins Hospital, noted that the technology had improved clinical decision-making as well as patient relations. When doctors know their treatment recommendations are being monitored for consistency, they're more likely to base decisions on clinical evidence rather than unconscious assumptions, she explained. The financial services industry had experienced a similar transformation. Banks with comprehensive bias monitoring reported that loan approval rates had become consistent across racial and ethnic groups, while default rates had actually decreased. The elimination of discriminatory lending practices had revealed that previous restrictions had been economically irrational, as well as morally wrong. We discovered that bias wasn't just harming customers. It was harming our bottom line, explained Wells Fargo CEO Charlie Scharf. Qualified borrowers were being turned away based on unconscious prejudice rather than objective risk assessment. Eliminating bias actually improved our lending portfolio performance. The retail industry had perhaps embraced bias prevention most enthusiastically. Major chains reported that the technology had not only eliminated discriminatory treatment, but had actually improved customer service across all groups by creating more systematic approaches to customer engagement. Target Corporation's CEO Brian Cornell noted that bias prevention had become a competitive advantage. Customers can feel the difference when they shop with us, he explained. They know they'll be treated with respect, regardless of who they are or what they look like. That trust translates into loyalty and revenue. The legal profession had undergone its own transformation. Courts, using bias detection technology, reported that sentencing disparities had decreased dramatically, while public confidence in the justice system had increased. The American Bar Association had made bias prevention training mandatory for all attorneys and law schools, had integrated inclusion technology into their curricula. We've made measurable progress toward the ideal of equal justice under law, observed Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson during a speech at the American Bar Association annual meeting. Technology has given us tools to identify and correct biases that have persisted for generations. The international impact had been equally significant. European companies had adopted American-developed bias prevention technology to comply with new EU regulations requiring systematic inclusion monitoring. Asian companies were implementing similar programs to attract global talent and customers. Bias prevention has become a competitive necessity in the global marketplace, explained Dr. Liu Wei, a business professor at Beijing University. Companies that can demonstrate systematic inclusion have advantages in recruiting customer acquisition and investor relations. The movement had also spawned entirely new industries. Bias prevention consulting had become a $12 billion sector employing over 200,000 professionals. Universities offered specialized degrees in inclusion technology. Venture capital firms had invested over $30 billion in companies developing bias detection and prevention tools. Perhaps most importantly, the cultural impact had been profound. A generation of Americans had grown up expecting systematic equality rather than hoping for individual tolerance. Discrimination hadn't been eliminated, but it had been marginalized and made accountable in ways that previous generations had never experienced. "We've changed the default," reflected Maria Washington during an interview about the 5-year anniversary of the Imperial Grand incident. Instead of accepting bias as inevitable and hoping for individual fairness, we now expect systematic inclusion and measure organizations against that standard. The transformation hadn't been without costs. Privacy advocates continued to raise concerns about comprehensive behavioral monitoring. Some employees struggled with the pressure of constant assessment. Implementation costs remained significant, though they were increasingly offset by improved performance and reduced legal liabilities. But surveys consistently showed strong public support for bias prevention programs. A recent Gallup poll found that 81% of Americans believed systematic bias monitoring was necessary for ensuring equal treatment, while only 23% had serious concerns about privacy implications. The public has decided that the benefits outweigh the costs, explained Gallup researcher Dr. Rebecca Martinez. People want to live and work in environments where they know they'll be treated fairly, and they're willing to accept some monitoring to achieve that goal. The movement had also demonstrated the power of market-based solutions to social problems. Rather than relying solely on government regulation or moral persuasion bias, prevention had succeeded by making inclusion profitable and discrimination costly. "We proved that capitalism and equality aren't contradictory," noted Daniel Washington during a reflection on the 5-year anniversary. When businesses profit from treating people fairly, systematic change becomes inevitable. As the movement entered its sixth year, new challenges were emerging. International expansion required adapting to different cultural contexts and regulatory frameworks. Technological advancement raised questions about the proper scope and limits of behavioral monitoring. Generational differences created debates about privacy versus inclusion priorities. But the fundamental transformation was irreversible. American business culture had shifted from accepting bias as inevitable to expecting inclusion as standard practice. The tools existed to measure and monitor fair treatment. The business case for equality had been proven beyond doubt. Most importantly, millions of Americans were living and working in environments where they could expect to be treated with dignity, regardless of their race, gender, ethnicity, or other characteristics. Children like Sophia Washington were growing up in a world where systematic discrimination was increasingly rare and accountable. "We didn't just change business practices," Sophia observed during her Harvard graduation speech. "We changed the American promise. For the first time in our history, equal treatment isn't just an aspiration. It's a measurable, enforceable standard." The promise wasn't yet fully realized, and the work of building inclusive institutions continued. But the foundation had been laid for a society where human dignity was not just proclaimed, but protected through systematic, accountable, and profitable business practices. The test that began in a hotel lobby had become a transformation that touched every aspect of American life. And it was just the beginning. 10 years after Daniel Washington's fateful test at the Imperial Grand Hotel, the world had changed in ways that even the most optimistic advocates of bias prevention could hardly have imagined. What had begun as a father's determination to protect his daughter's dignity had evolved into a global movement that fundamentally altered how institutions approached human equality. The technology that Samsung and Washington Ventures had pioneered was now standard practice across industries and continents. The third generation of AI bias detection systems had achieved remarkable sophistication, capable of identifying and preventing discriminatory behavior with accuracy rates exceeding 98%. But perhaps more importantly, the need for the technology was diminishing. A generation of workers had been trained in inclusive practices from the beginning of their careers. Unconscious bias hadn't been eliminated, but it had been so consistently identified and corrected that discriminatory behavior had become increasingly rare. Daniel Washington, now 55, had stepped back from day-to-day operations of Washington Ventures to focus on the Washington Foundation, which provided bias prevention technology and training to organizations worldwide. The foundation had worked with over 50,000 institutions across 47 countries, creating a global network of inclusive practices. The goal was never to monitor people forever, Daniel explained during a TED Talk commemorating the 10th anniversary of the Imperial Grand incident. The goal was to create cultures where monitoring becomes unnecessary because inclusive behavior becomes automatic. Sophia Washington had graduated from Harvard with dual degrees in social psychology and computer science. She now led the technical development team at the Washington Foundation, working on next-generation inclusion technology that could identify and prevent bias in emerging contexts like virtual reality environments and artificial intelligence systems. Each technological advance creates new opportunities for bias, Sophia noted during a conference on AI ethics. Our job is to ensure that inclusion principles are built into new technologies from the beginning, rather than retrofitted after discrimination becomes apparent. Her work had attracted attention from technology companies, governments, and international organizations seeking to prevent bias in increasingly complex technological systems. The principles that had been developed for hotel lobbies were now being applied to social media algorithms, automated lending systems, and even criminal justice software. Maria Washington had become a leading voice in international business ethics, serving on corporate boards and advising governments on inclusion policy. Her consulting firm had expanded globally, helping multinational corporations implement bias prevention programs across diverse cultural contexts. What we learned is that the desire for dignity and fair treatment is universal, Maria reflected during a World Economic Forum panel. The specific expressions of bias vary by culture, but the human need for respect transcends all boundaries. The Imperial Grand Hotel itself had become an unlikely symbol of transformation. The marble lobby where Daniel had been confronted by security was now home to a permanent exhibit documenting the history of the bias prevention movement. School groups, business leaders, and international visitors regularly toured the space to learn about systematic approaches to inclusion. Rebecca Martinez, the former receptionist, whose discriminatory behavior had catalyzed the original crisis, had become one of the movement's most effective advocates. Her presentations about unconscious bias and personal transformation had been viewed over 10 million times online and had inspired thousands of people to examine their own assumptions and behaviors. "I represent the possibility of redemption and growth," Rebecca said during a presentation to hospitality workers. "If someone like me who caused real harm through unconscious bias can learn and change, then anyone can. But change requires more than good intentions. It requires systematic accountability and sustained effort." Her story had become a central part of bias prevention training programs, demonstrating that individuals could overcome prejudice when given appropriate tools and motivation. The broader impact of the movement was visible in statistics that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. Employment discrimination complaints had decreased by 73% nationally. Customer satisfaction scores showed no significant variation across racial or ethnic groups in any major industry. Public trust in institutions had increased as people experienced consistent fair treatment in their daily lives. Educational achievement gaps had narrowed dramatically as bias prevention programs eliminated discriminatory disciplinary practices and ensured equal treatment in classrooms. Healthcare disparities had largely disappeared as medical professionals were trained and monitored to provide consistent care, regardless of patient demographics. The criminal justice system had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation. Courts using bias detection technology reported that sentencing disparities had decreased by 84%, while public confidence in judicial fairness had reached historic highs. "We've made measurable progress toward equal justice under law," observed Chief Justice Roberts during a speech marking the 10th anniversary of bias prevention in federal courts. "Technology has helped us identify and correct prejudices that had persisted for generations without accountability." The international expansion of bias prevention had created new diplomatic and economic relationships. Countries with strong inclusion practices had become preferred partners for trade and investment. The Washington model of systematic bias prevention had been adopted by the United Nations as a framework for member nations seeking to address discrimination. "Bias prevention has become a measure of institutional maturity," explained UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres. "Nations that can demonstrate systematic inclusion attract investment talent and international respect in ways that were previously unimaginable." The technology industry had been completely transformed by inclusion requirements. Social media platforms now used bias detection algorithms to identify and prevent discriminatory content and behavior. Search engines were regularly audited to ensure that results didn't reflect racial or gender bias. Online marketplaces monitored seller and buyer interactions to prevent discriminatory practices. "Inclusion has become a design principle rather than an afterthought," explained Dr. Fei Li, a leading AI researcher. "We now build bias prevention into systems from the beginning, rather than trying to fix discrimination after it becomes apparent." The financial markets had also evolved to reward inclusion. ESG, environmental, social, and governance investing, had grown to represent over $40 trillion globally, with bias prevention programs serving as key indicators of corporate responsibility. Companies with comprehensive inclusion practices consistently outperformed their peers in stock performance and investor confidence. Inclusion has become a leading indicator of business performance, noted BlackRock's CEO, Larry Fink. Companies that treat stakeholders fairly make better long-term investments because they avoid the risks and costs associated with discrimination. The transformation had not been without challenges. Privacy advocates continued to raise concerns about comprehensive behavioral monitoring. Some critics argued that bias prevention programs created new forms of thought control or ideological conformity. International expansion had required adapting to different cultural contexts and legal frameworks, but the benefits had proven overwhelming. Survey after survey showed that Americans across all demographic groups felt more respected and fairly treated in their daily interactions with institutions. Workplace satisfaction had increased dramatically. Customer loyalty had strengthened as people experienced consistent, dignified service. Perhaps most importantly, young people were growing up with radically different expectations about how institutions should operate. Sophia Washington's generation didn't see bias prevention as a special program. They saw it as basic competence. "My children will never experience what I experienced at Le Bernardin," Sophia noted during a recent interview. Not because individual prejudice has disappeared, but because systematic accountability makes discriminatory behavior costly and rare. The movement had also demonstrated the power of individual action to create systematic change. Daniel's decision to test his own hotels had rippled outward to transform entire industries and reshape cultural expectations about equality and accountability. One person's courage to document injustice became a movement that changed how America does business, observed historian Dr. Alvin Tillery Jr. in his comprehensive study of the bias prevention movement. It shows that systematic change often begins with individual acts of moral courage. The Washington family had used their platform and resources to ensure that the movement continued evolving and expanding. The Washington Foundation's endowment had grown to over $2 billion, providing sustainable funding for bias prevention research and implementation worldwide. But they were careful not to let their personal story overshadow the broader principles and practices that made the movement successful. The technology training and accountability measures could be implemented by any organization with the commitment to systematic inclusion. This was never about our family or our company, Daniel emphasized during his final speech as CEO of Washington Ventures. This was about proving that businesses can be profitable and principled simultaneously. The tools exist for any organization to eliminate bias and promote inclusion. The only question is whether they have the will to use them. As the movement entered its second decade, new challenges and opportunities were emerging. Climate change, technological disruption, and global economic uncertainty were creating new contexts for potential bias and discrimination. The next generation of leaders would need to adapt inclusion principles to emerging realities. But the foundation had been laid. American institutions had developed the tools, practices, and cultural expectations necessary to address bias systematically. The promise of equal treatment was no longer just an aspiration. It was an enforceable standard backed by technology training and sustained accountability. Most importantly, millions of people were living and working in environments where they could expect to be treated with dignity, regardless of their background or characteristics. The test that began in a hotel lobby had become a transformation that touched every aspect of human interaction with institutions. The movement continued, carried forward by new generations of leaders who saw inclusion not as a burden to bear, but as a competitive advantage to embrace. The legacy of that day at the Imperial Grand Hotel would endure not in monuments or memorials, but in the daily experiences of people who could walk into any business, any institution, any space, and expect to be treated with the respect and dignity that all humans deserve. The test was complete. The transformation continued. The promise of equality was becoming reality, one interaction at a time.